Welcome back, everyone. Continuing with the series of conversations with Indigenous thinkers and activists with different positions on the upcoming referendum on constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament. This week we have the sovereignty-led or progressive no position, which I will be discussing with Keiran Stewart-Assheton. Hopefully you enjoy and get something out of this conversation as well. Thank you to everyone who provided me feedback publicly and privately last week about the conversation that Celeste Little and I had. It seems to me that I really was servicing quite a few other people in similar positions, certainly to mine, with a bit of indecision and caught between different Indigenous voices that we all kind of respect and listen to, but really wanting some kind of clarity and direction. So let's continue on with this, and I'll see you again next week for the final conversation, which will be a yes position. I had the pleasure of speaking to the president of the Black People's Union and Yuin activist, Keiran Stewart-Assheton. Keiran, thanks so much for coming on, mate.
No worries, thanks for having me.
Firstly, before we get into the referendum, can you tell us a bit about the Black People's Union? This is a conversation I was kind of hoping to have unrelated to the referendum with you or other people from the BPU, but now that we're here, can you tell us a bit about it?
We're a revolutionary organisation of First Nations people from right across the continent. We came together to try and build some unity amongst different nations and different mob right across the continent. So instead of fighting 101 separate little battles, we can actually have a combined struggle against our one common enemy, which is, obviously this colonial system and capitalist economics. We formed with that in mind, and I suppose ultimately, what we're striving for is to be the vanguard of a united left and to have a revolution on this continent that can overthrow that colonial system and replace it with First Nations governance models.
In the upcoming referendum on constitutional recognition for Indigenous people and an advisory body known commonly as a voice to Parliament, how will you be voting?
I'll be voting a strong no.
Okay, and is that what you recommend for everyone else listening?
Yeah, definitely. I do encourage anybody who actually truly thinks that they support First Nation struggles to vote no on the day.
Okay. Can you tell me about that vote then, and how you've arrived at that conclusion, please?
Yeah, of course. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why we encourage people to vote no. I suppose first and foremost, one thing I want to address with that is we're not asking people to vote no because the voice doesn't go far enough. That's not why we're asking people to vote no. We're asking people to vote no because we actually see this as a harmful proposition that will actually further undermine our cause for sovereignty and self-determination and land rights, and will further harm our movement in the future.
Let me ask, for the sake of clarity, for the common understanding, because, there's a loose collective, I think, of yourself and a series of other people referring to yourselves as the Black Sovereignty Movement. And, a lot of that camp is endorsing a no vote, what's come to be termed as a progressive no vote. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's what it's called by most people. Is it enough from your perspective to simply not take part, or are you actively saying everyone vote no? Just to clarify that.
Yeah, no, of course. So we are actively asking people to vote no. At the end of the day, we don't encourage stuff like boycotts and abstentions because those sort of things don't actually have any real-world impact, and they're not active resistance, they're passive resistance. We encourage our allies to actively resist the colony. So a no vote helps in a pragmatic sense because it prevents the colony having another neoliberal tool that they can weaponise against First Nations people in the future, this being the constitutional recognition and the voice body itself. So yeah, we do encourage people to actually vote no, not just to abstain or boycott or, donkey vote or whatever else. We, encourage people to vote no, to stand in solidarity with us and reject this proposal.
I'll take something from a yes campaigner, prominent yes campaigner, Thomas Mayo, in terms of what he regularly seems to post, asking of the progressive no camp. He asked them to suggest an alternative. Many people in the progressive no camp I see begin suggesting an alternative, which is treaty, for example. But nonetheless, the question remains, if you don't want the voice, what do you want? So, Keiran, let me ask you, if you could scrap this entire referendum right now, what would you suggest as a push, in its place?
Ultimately, what we need is self-determination over our own affairs, and even if that's not 100% full self-determination, we need some sort of self-determination to be able to actually mitigate the horrible statistics and situation that we live under here in the colony. Now, there's a whole bunch of research from right across the world that proves and shows that self-determination is one of, if not the only way, that an oppressed minority who are suffering massive inequality can actually address their own circumstances and bring the equality of their people up to that of the rest of the broader population. Now, the voice body doesn't offer any form of self-determination, none at all. It actually takes power away from us. So, I'll explain what I mean here. Any person in Australia and any organisation in Australia can make a representation to Parliament on any issue. As it currently stands, anybody can do that, anyone can do that in Australia. Now, the voice body can also only make representations, but unlike everyone else, it will only be able to make representations on a small, limited amount of issues that the government decides beforehand. So it's actually taking power away that we would have otherwise.
So you see it as being even less powerful than, say, the capacity of any other public lobbying group to lobby in the media or in the public space, you're saying?
Yeah. And, we've had dozens of these advisory bodies throughout the past. None of them have been able to actually properly address our circumstances and our situation. But this advisory body being proposed is even weaker than all those past bodies. It's no form of self-determination at all.
Do you consider treaty negotiations, or rather a successful good treaty coming through, as an example of the self-determination you're talking about?
Yeah, as long as that treaty, actually provided us with the ability and the rights to be able to determine our own fate, then I would 100% support that over any advisory body. At the end of the day, though, it'll have to be a real proper treaty. We've got treaty negotiations going on right now in Victoria, for example, but those negotiations aren't for a real treaty. That's not an international treaty. That's just state legislation with the word treaty in its main title at the end of the day. It's not any form of treaty that we can, put our faith in to uphold rights and privileges for our people. So if there was a real treaty on the table, I would support that over this voice body.
Okay, so you're saying a real treaty would ultimately, it needs to begin at federal level and then perhaps be reflected at lower levels of government. Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, definitely.
I do wonder with treaty, funnily enough, I was reading a Bert Newton book some time ago that I found inside who was a really prominent celebrity, obviously of decades of his time. And this is a 1970s book about his career today. And he was talking really frankly about treaty in there. And I was like, this is a mainstream celebs book at the time. It's the kind of talk that would have been called actively communist today. And I only bring that up to say that we've really strayed away, and we've gradually, over the course of many neoliberal governments, we've gradually begun to see treaty as pie in the sky, despite the fact that in 2007 the UN introduced the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Only 4 signatory countries did not sign to that, and Australia was one of them, mind you. Nonetheless, there are many settler colonies who have gone on to arrange treaties. Why do you? What's your thoughts about why we think that treaty is some impossible concept in a mainstream sense in Australia?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it actually ties into this whole constitutional recognition thing. So back in the 80s, we had massive pushes for treaty here in Australia, and the same in the early 90s. There was this massive push for treaty. Treaty was at the forefront of everybody's mind in Australia, not just blackfellas, but non-Indigenous people as well. It was on everyone's mind and everyone's tongue. Now, we see Keating try and undermine this towards the end of his term by bringing in legislation like the Native Title Act to try and restrict our land rights, which was a big call for our treaty. Then we see the Howard government come in the mid-90s. And then from that, we really see the destruction of these calls for treaty and the replacement of it with a call for constitutional recognition instead. Now, one thing I want to quickly touch on here is there's 2 types of constitutional recognition out there. Back in the 90s, we did actually have mob calling for constitutional recognition. Not all mob, but we had some mob calling for it. But the constitutional recognition they were calling for was enshrined rights in the Constitution. So, things like designated seats in Parliament and, designated powers. so that we would be able to, have these powers enshrined within the Constitution so that we would always have them.
Yeah.
What's been offered on the table now, though, is essentially John Howard's version of constitutional recognition, which is, a symbolic preamble, for lack of a better term. Even though this one's not actually being proposed as a preamble, ultimately it's just symbolic. It's not, the enshrinement of any sort of rights or any sort of privileges for our people. It's just putting us into the Constitution to cede away our sovereignty and to assimilate us into this colony without giving us the powers that we called for as a part of that.
And a response I've seen to that is the term, this seems to get bandied about in response to people with a position like yours a fair bit, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. This is something of a good start, not an ideal outcome like a treaty, but something nice. I don't know what the word is. Productive start to start us off in that respect. Just I wanted to bring it up because it gets people with a position like yourself have that response. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. What's your response to that?
Yeah, look, I agree to some extent, in principle. Incremental change is better than no change at all. And, concessions that save lives and that help our people today are better than leaving them in the predicament that they are. But this voice proposition is not any form of incremental change. It's not that we're opposing it because, it's not perfect. It's because it's actually something that's harmful, something that's actually regressive. If this was a step in the right direction, I wouldn't be out here campaigning no. At most I'll be out here saying, we deserve something better than this, but, I'm not that opposed to it because it's a step forward in the right direction. But it is not a step forward in the right direction anyway. It's a step backwards. And especially when we consider the conservative history of this, rooted in the LNP government, and when we consider that we have mining execs themselves sitting on the referendum council and the Yes 23 board, people from BHP and from Woodside Petroleum and Rio Tinto, and these big companies are also bankrolling this whole process. At the end of the day, why would they want to do anything to help us when benefiting us directly impacts their hip pocket? Anything that would actually give mob true power over our land or any form of power over our land would negatively impact these mining companies that are blowing up our sacred sites nearly every day to, reaping billions of dollars in profit.
So you're saying that you think that the interest for, say, Rio Tinto is that if they invest in symbolic or gesture politics as opposed to real reform, then that will give them the veneer of looking progressive without actually having to do anything that it would involve ceasing blowing up Indigenous land. Is that right?
Yeah, but not just given the veneer of, being progressive, it's also enabling them and it's empowering them even further.
Okay.
We got to also, it's hard to explain in such a short amount of time. I could talk for hours about the history and the makeup of this whole entire body. But, we've got to contextualize it in the Howard era government because that's when it first came about.
Yeah.
And when it was first publicly proposed was in comparison with the Northern Territory intervention. It was proposed around the same time as the Northern Territory intervention.
Yes.
Now, on the face of it, we had the Northern Territory intervention, which is this horrible, horrific thing happening to First Nations people. Now, when you offer up some sort of, quote-unquote progressive reform in comparison with such an atrocious thing as the Northern Territory intervention, of course it looks good, but it's not. And it's just another way for them to look good while actually further impacting us. Now, the Northern Territory intervention, a part of that was massive land grants in the Northern Territory and, dispossessing Aboriginal people of native title and of land rights so that mines and logging companies had even greater access to our natural resources. Now, this constitutional recognition goes hand in hand with that. It doesn't empower us to give us our land back. It doesn't empower us to have a say over our natural resources. It does the opposite. It actually takes power away from us to be able to speak out on these issues. And that's why it is so publicly supported and funded by mining companies, because it actually benefits them. It's not that it's just, a progressive veneer for them. It actually benefits them and gives them greater control and access to the limited amount of land and natural resources that we actually have had given back to us.
Keiran, I notice that this perspective doesn't get, and has never really had anywhere near as much of a level of mainstream platforming as the kind of binary debate that's been permitted, particularly lately in the mainstream, which is that yes is progressive and no is at its worst racist. And that's another argument that does seem to be levelled against, a progressive or sovereignty no advocates, that, there are racists who campaign for a no vote for racist ends, whether it be that some of them wear suits and work in Canberra or wear more casual attire. And then the charge gets levelled at you that you're actually helping those racists, because despite you having reasons of your own, you are saying the same. But what do you say to people who level that charge?
Yeah, look, I think this is actually a criticism of the left in general in Australia. And the reason why is First Nations people, especially First Nations activists and leaders, have been opposing these constitutional recognition proposals for, going on nearly 2 decades now. The right wing in Australia originally pushed out these proposals. It's only in the last couple of months that this racist right has come out in opposition to this. Now, if the left in Australia and the mainstream in Australia actually, cared about Indigenous politics and actually cared about, our activism and our struggle, they would have picked up on our opposition to this proposal over the last 2 decades. But as it stands, the vast majority have not picked up on this, and the first they're hearing about opposition to constitutional recognition is the last couple of months coming from the racist right in Australia. So, this is very much a criticism and a reflection on the non-Indigenous Western left in general, and their inability and incapacity and, unwillingness to engage in First Nations politics and to actually support us and to understand our struggles and what we're about. But I suppose, to also answer your question, the way I like to look at it is, we haven't gone into this racist camp. These racists have come into our camp at the end of the day, for better or worse. They've come into our camp ultimately because, we were the ones out here saying no first. We've been saying no for years and years. They've only just decided to say no. And ultimately, at the end of the day, of course they're going to say no. They're not saying no because they actually oppose constitutional recognition. They're saying no for 3 main reasons. Now, one of those is because it benefits them to drum up a culture war against First Nations people. 75% of Australians are racist against First Nations people. Maybe not overtly racist, maybe not, out here calling for our lynching and genocide and whatever else and stuff, but to some extent they hold anti-Indigenous sentiments. Now, it's very easy for the right to drum up votes and to drum up support by engaging in a culture war against us and playing on this anti-Indigenous sentiment. That's one reason that the right has come out in strong opposition to this proposal. Another reason, of course, is because they actually wanted to hold on to it and wheel it out at a better, more convenient time for them. So what they were actually hoping to do is to wait until First Nations people and our movements picked up more momentum and more strength again, and then they could have thrown this constitutional recognition bone to silence us and to placate us and, make us more compliant, more or less, to undermine us and de-revolutionise us. So, that's another reason why they're in opposition to it being wheeled out now, because it's being wheeled out at a time when our movements don't actually have that much power and strength. It's not very strategic for them to wheel it out now. But, these are 2 of the main reasons that they're in opposition to it. And it's ultimately as well, the 3rd reason is, at the end of the day, people like Pauline Hanson, they would say no to giving us even the bare minimum scraps. Someone like Pauline Hanson, they would deny us even poison scraps. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, they don't want us to have anything. So, of course, they're out there campaigning no as well.
Yeah, this is their entire career. I would, I just want to reaffirm as well. It for many years it has been the publicised, self-admitted strategy of key right-wing populist strategists like Steve Bannon to look for and take up policies and arguments that the mainstream left or the activist left has abandoned. And this one, you could definitely see this over the course of the pandemic, where a lot of the things they picked up were, expressions of the right over the pandemic looked a lot like Occupy Wall Street in many respects. Yeah. And they certainly had the vibes. Now, mind you, they were blaming communists, Jewish people, the UN, and like, they've got their boogeymen, but the expressions of anti-authoritarianism were something that we all would have been rallying for that a couple of decades ago. And this is a strategy of the right, and that's something that I think really, really, you could argue, got rolled out here. So
Yeah, definitely. They're always, co-opting our slogans and our movements for their own agendas.
we're often seeing yes campaigners offer up a statistic they have of 80% of Indigenous people agreeing on a voice and or constitutional recognition, or that the gathering that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017 was a sweeping consensus of many or most Indigenous voices. What do you find? What do you say to that?
Look, I call that out as misinformation at the end of the day. And, that's ultimately what it is when we actually investigate where these statistics and where these sayings come from. So this 80%, for example, this comes from a poll of 300 people, and, they may or may not have been Indigenous people at the end of the day. I'm not denying anybody's identity, but there was no protocols in place to verify whether or not the people who done the poll were actually First Nations people. Anybody could filter that. But at the end of the day, this is a poll of only 300 people that have come out saying yes to this whole proposal. But the question itself didn't explain, how the voice would operate or what this would look like. It was more or less a question, something along the lines of, do you support First Nations people having a voice in Parliament? Now, most people would say yes to that at the end of the day. It didn't say, do you support First Nations people having a powerless voice in Parliament that will be completely subservient under the control of the government? That wasn't the question being asked. It was just, do you support First Nations people having a voice in Parliament? Now, conveniently, they released these figures the day after Invasion Day. Now, on Invasion Day, every speaker at every major rally right across the continent spoke out against constitutional recognition and this referendum process. Everyone denounced it, everyone was against it. The mainstream media didn't report on that, though, in their Invasion Day reporting. And I know for a fact that this is what was spoken out at these rallies, because I was at one of these rallies myself as a speaker, and I know many of the organisers from around the continent who organise these rallies, and all of us are firmly in the no camp. But the mainstream media didn't mention that people were out there rallying against this voice to Parliament and this constitutional recognition. They just lightly touched on, the same old issues that we regularly would speak about, like land rights, deaths in custody, that sort of stuff. There was no mention made in mainstream media. The day after Invasion Day, mainstream media come out with this figure about 80% of First Nations people support the voice to Parliament. So, it was a very tactical thing for them to do. They, deliberately excluded our cause from their reporting on Invasion Day, and then pushed out this big statistic that came from 300 people, only 300 people. This big statistic about 80% of First Nations people supporting it. Now, another thing to consider here is it's a statistical impossibility at the end of the day for 80% of mob to support something, even if you did manage to poll the majority of mob. 1/3 of our people are age 15 or under. That's 33% right there. Can't even vote. You know what I mean? And that's before we include all the people who are incarceration, incarcerated at the highest rate in the world. That's before we include all the people who live out in regional, remote and rural areas who don't have access to technology or information to be able to engage in these debates, or to even be able to lodge a vote themselves in any way. And another thing that I want to touch on is the regional dialogues and the Yuin Convention itself. So another thing that's ruled out is that this is a call from First Nations people. Now, that is only partly true. So as I was mentioning earlier, back in the 90s, there was some mob who were calling for constitutional recognition, but it wasn't the constitutional recognition that's being called for today. It was constitutional recognition in the form of enshrined rights, seats in Parliament, etc., etc. Things that would actually make a tangible, substantial change to our lives and empower us properly and give us self-determination. That's not what's being proposed today, though. It's a completely different kind of constitutional recognition to what we were actually calling for back in the 90s and back in the 1995 ATSIC report to Keating on native title and social justice, which is what a lot of people try and quote when they talk about, mob have been calling for this for decades. It's not the constitutional recognition we're calling for. Now, at these regional dialogues, in the lead up to the Yuin Convention, they had 12 regional dialogues and 1 information day. 13 sessions all up. We've got 250 nations. They came to 13 nations to consult us. And then they brag about this being the largest consultation of First Nations people the government has ever done. But, that just further highlights how much the government is not willing to listen to our voices and is not willing to consult with us. 13 nations out of 250, that's 5%. They've come to 5% of our people. And even then, 5% of our nations, but 0.1% of our population participated in these regional dialogues. 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1%. Now, despite all of that though, there was a freedom of information request that, released what actually was called for at these regional dialogues in the lead up to the Yalara Convention. And we at the BPU have gone through that. And what we saw was nobody there asked for an advisory body. Nobody at any of the regional dialogues said, we want a powerless body. What was asked for at the regional dialogues were, again, designated seats in Parliament, things like a treaty, things like a truth commission, things like the power and ability for our people to be able to put forward our own legislation and to veto legislation that would negatively impact us. Nobody asked for what was on offer today in the Uluru Statement. So then we had the Yalara Convention at the end of these regional dialogues. Now, at the Yalara Convention, we had people deliberately excluded from attending. And we even have people like Megan Davis, who are on camera, on record, bragging about how they excluded radical and staunch mob from attending these dialogues and from coming to the Yalara Convention because they didn't want mob there who actually opposed the colonial capitalist government and who would actually call for more and demand more than tokenistic reforms. So they deliberately excluded mob. Despite that, we still had a large percentage of that mob at the Yalara Convention walk out in protest. And the reason that they walked out in protest was because what was happening was the Referendum Council, which was established under Malcolm Turnbull, mind you, and has a whole bunch of LNP former ministers and staffers on it. The Referendum Council was offering the Uluru Statement as it was. They weren't saying, what would mob like? They weren't asking mob for feedback on what was on offer. They were saying, here's what's on offer, you take it or you leave it. This is all you're getting. This wasn't a call from mob. This was a top-down approach from LNP staffers and ministers saying, here's what's on the table. It's up to you. You can take it or you can leave it, but we're not going to change what's on the table. So, obviously we had a whole bunch of mob walk out in protest.
Okay. Yeah.
Of course they would. And this is why they walked out in protest. It's because it was offered in this way. Now, we still had some mobs sign on to the Uluru Statement afterwards. But again, these people signed a blank canvas. And there's photos out there showing this canvas with all these signatures on it. But there's no Uluru Statement written up that they've signed around. They put that in later. And they put that in with ideas from people like Noel Pearson and Mark Liebler. Ultimately, they're the main authors behind this Uluru Statement. It's not First Nations elders and activists who authored it. It's Mark Liebler and Noel Pearson. Now, for those who are a bit unfamiliar with who these people are, Mark Liebler is a non-Indigenous person. They are the chair of a pro-Israeli body here in Australia that lobbies the government to provide resources and support to Israel's occupation of Palestine. That's who is behind these things.
Yep.
People like this, and everybody knows, the sort of atrocities happening over there right now. Everybody knows how atrocious the Israeli government is. But yet we've got people who are firm, staunch public supporters of the Israeli occupation of Palestine here drafting up constitutional recognition statements for blackfellas in Australia. And we're meant to trust this process?
Yeah.
This is how ridiculous this process is. But all of this stuff is not publicly put in the mainstream media. It's there for anybody to find. Anybody can go jump on Google, can look at the About section of the Yes 23 campaign and the Referendum Council and see Mark Liebler's name and picture for themselves as being somebody who's heavily involved in this. But it's not something that's, wheeled out publicly that this pro-Israeli genocidal maniac is behind stuff like this.
So you've suggested that people go and have a look at some of the S23 documentation to learn about this. And where else can people read about maybe the work of Black People's Union or some of the stuff that we've been discussing here? Where should people go to after this conversation if they want to learn more?
Yeah, no worries. So there's a few places I'll direct people to. There's some really great analysis out there and even more history on it and stuff that goes right way more into depth than I have about the history and the proposals and stuff. So we've got some stuff on our website, blackpeoplesunion.org. We've also got a lot of stuff on our Facebook, our Instagram, and our YouTube, which goes further into this whole referendum process. I would suggest people go and suss out the Black Sovereign Movement website. treatybeforevoice.com as well. Go check them out. There's a whole bunch of resources on all three of these websites. You can read for hours and hours and hours about the history, the proposal, as well as what else is on offer and what we demand and call for instead.
Keiran, thanks for rolling out the sovereignty-led or the progressive no argument. Thanks for your time and your thoughts. Thanks for coming on, mate.
No worries. Cheers for having me. A pleasure.